Chapter 5. The End of Williams. As I have said, there was a lot of talk, among the crowd of us for'ard, about Tom's strange accident. None of the men knew that Williams and I had seen it happen. Stubbins gave it as his opinion that Tom had been sleepy and missed the foot-rope. Tom, of course, would not have this by any means. Yet he had no one to appeal to, for at that time he was just as ignorant as the rest, that we had seen the sail flap up over the yard. Stubbins insisted that it stood to reason it couldn't be the wind. There wasn't any, he said, and the rest of the men agreed with him. "Well," I said, "I don't know about all that. I'm a bit inclined to think Tom's yarn is the truth." "How do you make that out?" Stubbins asked unbelievingly. "There ain't nothing like enough wind." "What about the place on his forehead?" I inquired in turn. "How are you going to explain that?" "I expect he knocked himself there when he slipped," he answered. "Likely 'noughly," agreed old Jasket, who was sitting smoking on a chest nearby. "Well, you're both a damn long way out of it," Tom chipped in, pretty warm. "I wasn't asleep, and the sail did bloomin' well hit me." "Don't you be impertinent, young feller," said Jasket. I joined in again. "There's another thing, Stubbins," I said. "The gasket Tom was hanging by was on the after side of the yard. That looks as if the sail might have flapped it over, and if there were wind enough to do the one, it seems to me that it might have done the other." "Do you mean that it was under the yard, or over the top?" he asked. "Over the top, of course. What's more, the foot of the sail was hanging over the after part of the yard in a bight." Stubbins was plainly surprised at that, and before he was ready with his next objection, Plummer spoke. "Who saw it?" he asked. "I saw it," I said a bit sharply. "So did Williams. So, for that matter, did the second mate." Plummer relapsed into silence and smoked, and Stubbins broke out afresh. "I reckon Tom must have had a hold of the foot and the gasket, and pulled 'em over the yard when he tumbled." "No," interrupted Tom. "The gasket was under the sail. I couldn't even see it, and I hadn't time to get hold of the foot of the sail before it up and caught me smack in the face." "How did yer get hold of the gasket when yer fell, then?" asked Plummer. "He didn't get hold of it," I answered for Tom. "It had taken a turn round his wrist, and that's how we found him hanging." "Do you mean to say as he hadn't got hold of the gasket?" Quoin inquired, pausing in the lighting of his pipe. "Of course I do," I said. "A chap doesn't go hanging onto a rope when he's jolly well been knocked senseless." "You're right," assented Jock. "You're quite right there, Jessup." Quoin concluded the lighting of his pipe. "I dunno," he said. I went on without noticing him. "Anyway, when Williams and I found him, he was hanging by the gasket, and it had a couple of turns round his wrist. And besides that, as I said before, the foot of the sail was hanging over the after side of the yard, and Tom's weight on the gasket was holding it there." "It's damned queer," said Stubbins in a puzzled voice. "There don't seem to be no way of getting a proper explanation to it." I glanced at Williams to suggest that I should tell all that we had seen, but he shook his head, and after a moment's thought it seemed to me that there was nothing to be gained by doing so. We had no very clear idea of the thing that had happened, and our half-facts and guesses would only have tended to make the matter appear more grotesque and unlikely. The only thing to be done was to wait and watch. If we could only get hold of something tangible, then we might hope to tell all that we knew, without being made into laughing-stocks. I came out of my think abruptly. Stubbins was speaking again. He was arguing the matter with one of the other men. "You see, with there being no wind, scarcely, there are things impossible, and yet—" The other man interrupted with some remark I did not catch. "No," I heard Stubbins say. "I'm out of my reckoning. I don't savvy it one bit. It's too much like a damn fairy tale." "Look at his wrist," I said. Tom held out his right hand and arm for inspection. It was considerably swollen where the rope had been round it. "Yes," admitted Stubbins, "that's right enough, but it don't tell you nothing." I made no reply. As Stubbins said, it told you nothing, and there I let it drop. Yet I have told you this, as showing how the matter was regarded in the forecastle. Still, it did not occupy our minds very long, for, as I have said, there were further developments. The 3 following nights passed quietly, and then, on the 4th, all those curious signs and hints culminated suddenly in something extraordinarily grim. Yet everything had been so subtle and intangible, and indeed so was the affair itself, that only those who had actually come in touch with the invading fear seemed really capable of comprehending the terror of the thing. The men, for the most part, began to say the ship was unlucky, and of course, as usual, there was some talk of there being a Jonah in the ship. Still, I cannot say that none of the men realized there was anything horrible and frightening in it all, for I am sure that some did, a little, and I think Stubbins was certainly one of them, though I feel certain that he did not at the time, grasp a quarter of the real significance that underlay the several queer matters that had disturbed our nights. He seemed to fail somehow to grasp the element of personal danger that to me was already plain. He lacked sufficient imagination, I suppose, to piece the things together, to trace the natural sequence of the events and their development. Yet I must not forget, of course, that he had no knowledge of those 2 first incidents. If he had, perhaps, he might have stood where I did. As it was, he had not seemed to reach out at all, not even in the matter of Tom and the 4 Royal. Now, however, after the thing I'm about to tell you, he seemed to see a little way into the darkness and realize possibilities. I remembered the 4th night well. It was a clear, starlit, moonless sort of night. At least, I think there was no moon, or at any rate, the moon could have been little more than a thin crescent, for it was near the dark time. The wind had breezed up a bit, but still remained steady. We were slipping along at about 6 or 7 knots an hour. It was our middle watch on deck, and the ship was full of the blow and hum of the wind aloft. Williams and I were the only ones about the main deck. He was leaning over the weather pin-rail, smoking, while I was pacing up and down between him and the forehatch. Stubbins was on the lookout. 2 bells had gone some minutes, and I was wishing to goodness that it was 8, and time to turn in. Suddenly, overhead, there sounded a sharp crack, like the report of a rifle shot. It was followed instantly by the rattle and crash of sailcloth thrashing in the wind. Williams jumped away from the rail and ran aft a few steps. I followed him, and together we stared upwards to see what had gone. Indistinctly, I made out that the weather sheet of the fore-topgallant had carried away, and the clew of the sail was whirling and banging about in the air, and every few moments hitting the steel yard a blow, like the thump of a great sledge-hammer. "It's the shackle, or one of the links that's gone, I think," I shouted to Williams, above the noise of the sail. "That's the spectacle that's hitting the yard." "Yes," he shouted back, and went to get hold of the clew-line. I ran to give him a hand. At the same moment I caught the second mate's voice away aft shouting. Then came the noise of running feet, and the rest of the watch and the second mate were with us almost at the same moment. In a few minutes we had the yard lowered and the sail clewed up. Then Williams and I went aloft to see where the sheet had gone. It was much as I had supposed. The spectacle was all right, but the pin had gone out of the shackle, and the shackle itself was jammed into the sheave-hole in the yard-arm. Williams sent me down for another pin, while he unbent the clew-line and overhauled it down to the sheet. When I returned with a fresh pin, I screwed it into the shackle, clipped on the clew-line, and sung out to the men to take a pull on the rope. As they did, and at the second heave the shackle came way. When it was high enough, I went up on to the topgallant yard and held the chain, while William shackled it into the spectacle. Then he bent on the clew-line afresh and sung out to the second mate that we were ready to hoist away. "You'd better go down and give 'em a all," he said. "I'll stye and light up the sail." "Right-ho, Williams," I said, getting into the rigging. "Don't let the ship's bogey run away with you." This remark I made in a moment of light-heartedness, such as will come to anyone aloft at times. I was exhilarated for the time being, and quite free from the sense of fear that had been with me so much of late. I suppose this was due to the freshness of the wind. "There's more'n one," he said, in that curiously short way of his. "What?" I asked. He repeated his remark. I was suddenly serious. The reality of all the impossible details of the past weeks came back to me, vivid and beastly. "What do you mean, Williams?" I asked him. But he had shut up and would say nothing. "What do you know? How much do you know?" I went on quickly. "Why did you never tell me that you—" The second mate's voice interrupted me abruptly. "Now then, up there, are you going to keep us waiting all night? One of you come down and give us a pull on the halyards, and the other stay up and light up the gear." "Aye, aye, sir," I shouted back. Then I turned to Williams hurriedly. "Look here, Williams," I said. "If you think there is really a danger in your being alone up here—" I hesitated for words to express what I meant. Then I went on. "Well, I'll jolly well stay up with you." The second mate's voice came again. "Come on now, one of you, make a move. What the hell are you doing?" "Coming, sir," I sung out. "Shall I stay?" I asked definitely. "Garn," he said. "Don't you fret yourself. I'll take her bloomin' pie-dye out of her. Blarst 'em, I ain't funky of 'em." I went. That was the last word William spoke to anyone living. I reached the decks and tailed on to the halyards. We had nearly mastheaded the yard, and the second mate was looking up at the dark outline of the sail, ready to sing out "Belay," when all at once there came a queer sort of muffled shout from Williams. "Vast hauling, you men!" shouted the second mate. We stood silent and listened. "What's that, Williams?" he sung out. "Are you all clear?" For nearly half a minute we stood listening, but there came no reply. Some of the men said afterwards that they had noticed a curious rattling and vibrating noise aloft that sounded faintly above the hum and swirl of the wind. Like the sound of loose ropes being shaken and slatted together, you know. Whether this noise was really heard, or whether it was something that had no existence outside of their imaginations, I cannot say. I heard nothing of it, but then I was at the tail end of the rope, and furthest from the fore rigging, while those who heard it were on the fore part of the halyards and close up to the shrouds. The second mate put his hands to his mouth. "Are you all clear there?" he shouted again. The answer came, unintelligible and unexpected. It ran like this. "Blarst you, I stayed. Did you think? Drive, pie-dye." And then there was a sudden silence. I stared up at the dim sail, astonished. "He's dotty," said Stubbins, who had been told to come off the lookout and give us a pull. "He's as mad as a bloomin' adder," said Quoin, who was standing foreside of me. "He's been queer all along." "Silence there!" shouted the second mate. Then, "Williams!" No answer. "Williams!" more loudly. Still no answer. Then, "Damn you, you jumped-up cockney crocodile! Can't you hear? Are you blooming well deaf?" There was no answer, and the second mate turned to me. "Jump aloft smartly now, Jessup, and see what's wrong." "Aye, aye, sir," I said, and made a run for the rigging. I felt a bit queer. Had Williams gone mad? He certainly always had been a bit funny. Or, and the thought came with a jump, had he seen— I did not finish. Suddenly, up aloft, there sounded a frightful scream. I stopped, with my hand on the sheer pole. The next instant, something fell out of the darkness, a heavy body that struck the deck near the waiting men with a tremendous crash and a loud, ringing, wheezy sound that sickened me. Several of the men shouted out loud in their fright and let go of the halyards. But luckily the stopper held it, and the yard did not come down. Then, for the space of several seconds, there was a dead silence among the crowd, and it seemed to me that the wind had in it a strange moaning note. The second mate was the first to speak. His voice came so abruptly that it startled me. "Get a light, one of you, quick now!" There was a moment's hesitation. "Fetch one of the binnacle lamps, you, Tammy." "Aye, aye, sir," the youngster said in a quavering voice, and ran aft. In less than a minute, I saw the light coming towards us along the deck. The boy was running. He reached us and handed the lamp to the second mate, who took it and went towards the dark, huddled heap on the deck. He held the light out before him and peered at the thing. "My God," he said, "it's Williams." He stooped lower with the light, and I saw details. It was Williams right enough. The second mate told a couple of the men to lift him and straighten him out on the hatch. Then he went aft to call the skipper. He returned in a couple of minutes with an old ensign which he spread over the poor beggar. Almost directly the captain came hurrying forward along the decks. He pulled back one end of the ensign and looked. Then he put it back quietly, and the second mate explained all that we knew in a few words. "Would you leave him where he is, sir?" he asked, after he had told everything. "The night's fine," said the captain. "You may as well leave the poor devil there." He turned and went aft slowly. The man who was holding the light swept it round so that it showed the place where Williams had struck the deck. The second mate spoke abruptly. "Get a broom and a couple of buckets, some of you." He turned sharply and ordered Tammy onto the poop. As soon as he had seen the yard mastheaded and the ropes cleared up, he followed Tammy. He knew well enough that it would not do for the youngster to let his mind dwell too much on the poor chap on the hatch, and I found out a little later that he gave the boy something to occupy his thoughts. After they had gone aft, we went into the forecastle. Everyone was moody and frightened. For a little while we sat about in our bunks and on the chests, and no one said a word. The watch below were all asleep, and not one of them knew what had happened. All at once, Plummer, whose wheel it was, stepped over the starboard washboard into the forecastle. "What's up, anyway?" he asked. "Is Williams much hurt?" "Shh," I said. "You'll wake the others. Who's taking your wheel?" "Tammy. Their second sent him. He said I could go forward and have her smoke. He said Williams had had her fall." He broke off and looked across the forecastle. "Where is he?" he inquired in a puzzled voice. I glanced at the others, but no one seemed inclined to start yarning about it. "He fell from the topgallant rigging," I said. "Where is he?" he repeated. "Smashed up," I said. "He's lying on the hatch." "Dead?" he asked. I nodded. "I guessed 'twere something pretty bad when I saw the old man come forward. How did it happen?" He looked round at the lot of us sitting there silent and smoking. "No one knows," I said, and glanced at Stubbins. I caught him eyeing me doubtfully. After a moment's silence, Plummer spoke again. "I heard him screech when I was at the wheel. He must have got hurt up aloft." Stubbins struck a match and proceeded to relight his pipe. "How do you mean?" he asked, speaking for the first time. "How do I mean? Well, I can't say. Maybe he jammed his fingers between the parrel and the mast." "What about his swearing at their second mate? Was that 'cause he jammed his fingers?" put in Coyne. "I never heard about that," said Plummer. "Who heard him?" "I should think everybody on the bloomin' ship heard him," Stubbins answered. "All the same, I ain't sure he was swearing at their second mate. I thought at first he'd gone dotty and was cussin' him, but somehow it don't seem likely, now I come to think. It don't stand a reason he should go to cuss their man. There was nothing to go cussin' about. What's more, he didn't seem to be talking down to us on deck, what I could make out. Besides, what would he want to go talking to the second about his payday? He looked across to where I was sitting. Jock, who was smoking quietly on the chest next to me, took his pipe slowly out from between his teeth. "You're no far out, Stubbins, I'm thinking. You're no far out," he said, nodding his head. Stubbins still continued to gaze at me. "What's your ID?" he said abruptly. It may have been my fancy, but it seemed to me that there was something deeper than the mere sense the question conveyed. I glanced at him. I couldn't have said myself just what my idea was. "I don't know," I answered, a little adrift. "He didn't strike me as cursing the second mate. That is, I should say, after the first minute." "Just what I say," he replied. "Another thing, don't it strike you as being bloomin' queer about Tom nearly coming down by her run, and then this?" I nodded. "It would have been all up with Tom if it hadn't been for the gasket." He paused. After a moment he went on again. "That was only 3 or 4 nights ago." "Well," said Plummer, "what are you driving at?" "Nothing," answered Stubbins. "Only it's damned queer. Looks as though their ship might be unlucky after all." "Well," agreed Plummer, "things has been a bit funny lately. And then there's what's happened ternight. I shall hang on pretty tight the next time I go aloft." Old Jasket took his pipe from his mouth and sighed. "Things is going wrong most every night," he said, almost pathetically. "It's as different as chalk and cheese to what it were when we started this here trip. I thought it were all hellish rot about her being haunted, but it's not, seemly." He stopped and expectorated. "She ain't haunted," said Stubbins. "Leastways, not like you mean." He paused, as though trying to grasp some elusive thought. "Eh?" said Jasket in the interval. Stubbins continued, without noticing the query. He appeared to be answering some half-formed thought in his own brain, rather than Jasket. "Things is queer, and it's been a bad job tonight. I don't savvy one bit what Williams was saying of up aloft. I've thought sometimes he'd something on his mind." Then, after a pause of about half a minute, he said this. "Who was he saying that to?" "Eh?" said Jasket again, with a puzzled expression. "I was thinking," said Stubbins, knocking out his pipe on the edge of the chest. "Perhaps you're right, after all." End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Another Man to the Wheel. The conversation had slacked off. We were all moody and shaken, and I know I, for one, was thinking some rather troublesome thoughts. Suddenly I heard the sound of the second's whistle. Then his voice came along the deck. "Another man to the wheel!" "He's singing out for someone to go aft and relieve the wheel," said Quoin, who had gone to the door to listen. "You'd better hurry up, Plummer." "What's their time?" asked Plummer, standing up and knocking out his pipe. "Must be close on to 4 bells. Whose next wheel is it?" "It's all right, Plummer," I said, getting up from the chest on which I had been sitting. "I'll go along. It's my wheel, and it only wants a couple of minutes to 4 bells." Plummer sat down again, and I went out of the forecastle. Reaching the poop, I met Tammy on the lee side, pacing up and down. "Who's at the wheel?" I asked him, in astonishment. "The second mate," he said in a shaky sort of voice. "He's waiting to be relieved. I'll tell you all about it as soon as I get a chance." I went on aft to the wheel. "Who's that?" the second inquired. "It's Jessup, sir," I answered. He gave me the course, and then, without another word, went forward along the poop. On the break I heard him call Tammy's name, and then for some minutes he was talking to him, though what he was saying I could not possibly hear. For my part, I was tremendously curious to know why the second mate had taken the wheel. I knew that if it were just a matter of bad steering on Tammy's part, he would not have dreamt of doing such a thing. There had been something queer happening, about which I had yet to learn. Of this I felt sure. Presently the second mate left Tammy and commenced to walk the weather side of the deck. Once he came right aft, and, stooping down, peered under the wheelbox, but never addressed a word to me. Some time later he went down the weather ladder onto the main deck. Directly afterwards Tammy came running up to the lee side of the wheelbox. "I've seen it again," he said, gasping with sheer nervousness. "What?" I said. "The thing," he answered. Then he leant across the wheelbox and lowered his voice. "It came up over the lee rail, up out of the sea," he added, with an air of telling something unbelievable. I turned more towards him, but it was too dark to see his face with any distinctness. I felt suddenly husky. My God, I thought, and then I made a silly effort to protest, but he cut me short with a certain impatient hopelessness. "For God's sake, Jessup," he said, "do stow all that. It's no good. I must have someone to talk to, or I shall go dotty." I saw how useless it was to pretend any sort of ignorance. Indeed, really, I had known it all along, and avoided the youngster on that very account, as you know. "Go on," I said. "I'll listen, but you'd better keep an eye for the second mate. He may pop up any minute." For a moment he said nothing, and I saw him peering stealthily about the poop. "Go on," I said. "You'd better make haste, or he'll be up before you're halfway through. What was he doing at the wheel when I came up to relieve it? Why did he send you away from it?" "He didn't," Tammy replied, turning his face towards me. "I bunked away from it." "What for?" I asked. "Wait a minute," he answered, "and I'll tell you the whole business. You know the second mate sent me to the wheel. After that—" He nodded his head forward. "Yes," I said. "Well, I'd been here about 10 minutes, or a quarter of an hour, and I was feeling rotten about Williams, and trying to forget it all and keep the ship on her course and all that. When, all at once, I happened to glance to leeward, and there I saw it coming over the rail. My God, I didn't know what to do. The second mate was standing forward on the break of the poop, and I was here all by myself. I felt as if I were frozen stiff. When it came towards me, I let go of the wheel and yelled and bunked forward to the second mate. He caught hold of me and shook me, but I was so jolly frightened I couldn't say a word. I could only keep on pointing. The second kept asking, 'Where?' and then, all at once, I found I couldn't see the thing. I don't know whether he saw it. I'm not at all certain he did. He just told me to damn well get back to the wheel and stop making a damned fool of myself. I said out straight I wouldn't go. So he blew the whistle and sung out for someone to come aft and take it. Then he ran and got hold of the wheel himself. You know the rest." "You're quite sure it wasn't thinking about Williams made you imagine you saw something?" I said, more to gain a moment to think than because I believed that it was the case. "I thought you were going to listen to me seriously," he said bitterly. "If you won't believe me, what about the chap the second mate saw? What about Tom? What about Williams? For goodness sake, don't try to put me off like you did last time. I nearly went cracked with wanting to tell someone who would listen to me and wouldn't laugh. I could stand anything but this being alone. There's a good chap, don't pretend you don't understand. Tell me what it all means. What is this horrible man that I've twice seen? You know something, and I believe you're afraid to tell anyone, for fear of being laughed at. Why don't you tell me? You needn't be afraid of my laughing." He stopped suddenly. For the moment I said nothing in reply. "Don't treat me like a kid, Jessup," he exclaimed quite passionately. "I won't," I said, with a sudden resolve to tell him everything. "I need someone to talk to just as badly as you do." "What does it all mean, then?" he burst out. "Are they real? I always used to think it was all a yarn about such things." "I'm sure I don't know what it all means, Tammy," I answered. "I'm just as much in the dark there as you are. And I don't know whether they're real. That is, not as we consider things real. You don't know what I saw a queer figure down on the main deck several nights before you saw that thing up here." "Didn't you see this one?" he cut in quickly. "Yes," I answered. "Then why did you pretend not to have?" he said in a reproachful voice. "You don't know what a state you put me into, what with my being certain that I had seen it, and then you being so jolly positive that there had been nothing. At one time I thought I was going clean off my dot, until the second mate saw that man go up the main. Then I knew that there must be something in the thing I was certain I'd seen." "I thought perhaps that if I told you I hadn't seen it, you would think you'd been mistaken," I said. "I wanted you to think it was imagination, or a dream, or something of that sort." "And all the time you knew about that other thing you'd seen?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "It was thundering decent of you," he said, "but it wasn't any good." He paused a moment, then he went on. "It's terrible about Williams. Do you think he saw something up aloft?" "I don't know, Tammy," I said. "It's impossible to say. It may have only been an accident." I hesitated to tell him what I really thought. "What was he saying about his payday? Who was he saying it to?" "I don't know," I said again. "He was always cracked about taking payday out of her. You know, he stayed in her on purpose, when all the others left. He told me that he wasn't going to be done out of it for anyone." "What did the other lot leave for?" he asked. Then, as the idea seemed to strike him, "Jove, do you think they saw something and got scared? It's quite possible. You know, we only joined her in Frisco. She led no prentices on the passage out. Our ship was sold, and so they sent us aboard here to come home." "They may have," I said. "Indeed, from things I've heard William say, I'm pretty certain he, for one, guessed or knew a jolly sight more than we've any idea of." "And now he's dead," said Tammy solemnly. "We'll never be able to find out from him now." For a few moments he was silent. Then he went off on another track. "Doesn't anything ever happen in the mate's watch?" "Yes," I answered. "There are several things happened lately that seem pretty queer. Some of his side have been talking about them. But he's too jolly pig-headed to see anything. He just curses his chaps and puts it all down to them." "Still," he persisted, "things seem to happen more in our watch than in his. I mean, bigger things. Look at tonight." "We've no proof, you know," I said. He shook his head doubtfully. "I shall always funk going aloft now." "Nonsense," I told him. "It may only have been an accident." "Don't," he said. "You know you don't think so, really." I answered nothing just then, for I knew very well that he was right. We were silent for a couple of moments. Then he spoke again. "Is the ship haunted?" For an instant I hesitated. "No," I said at length. "I don't think she is. I mean, not in that way." "What way, then?" "Well, I formed a bit of a theory that seems wise one minute and cracked the next. Of course, it's as likely to be all wrong, but it's the only thing that seems to me to fit in with all the beastly things we've had lately." "Go on," he said, with an impatient, nervous movement. "Well, I've an idea that it's nothing in the ship that's likely to hurt us. I scarcely know how to put it, but if I'm right in what I think, it's the ship herself that's the cause of everything." "What do you mean?" he asked in a puzzled voice. "Do you mean that the ship is haunted after all?" "No," I answered. "I just told you I didn't. Wait until I finish what I was going to say." "All right," he said. "About that thing you saw tonight," I went on. "You say it came over the lee rail, up onto the poop?" "Yes," he answered. "Well, the thing I saw came up out of the sea and went back into the sea." "Jove," he said, and then, "Yes, go on." "My idea is that this ship is open to be boarded by those things," I explained. "What they are, of course, I don't know. They look like men, in lots of ways, but, well, the Lord knows what's in the sea. though we don't want to go imaging silly things, of course. And then again, it seems fat-headed calling anything silly. That's how I keep going, in a sort of blessed circle. I don't know a bit whether they're flesh and blood, or whether they're what we should call ghosts or spirits." "They can't be flesh and blood," Tammy interrupted. "Where would they live? Besides, that first one I saw, I thought I could see through it. And this last one, the second mate would have seen it. And they would drown." "Not necessarily," I said. "Oh, but I'm sure they're not," he insisted. "It's impossible." "So are ghosts, when you're feeling sensible," I answered. "But I'm not saying they are flesh and blood. Though, at the same time, I'm not going to say straight out they're ghosts. Not yet, at any rate." "Where do they come from?" he asked, stupidly enough. "Out of the sea," I told him. "You saw for yourself." "Then why don't other vessels have them coming aboard?" he said. "How do you account for that?" "In a way, though sometimes it seems cracky, I think I can, according to my idea," I answered. "How?" he inquired again. "Why, I believe that this ship is open, as I've told you, exposed, unprotected, or whatever you like to call it. I should say it's reasonable to think that all the things of the material world are barred, as it were, from the immaterial, but that in some cases the barrier may be broken down. That's what may have happened to this ship, and if it has, she may be naked to the attacks of beings belonging to some other state of existence." "What's made her like that?" he asked in a really odd sort of tone. "The Lord knows," I answered. "Perhaps something to do with magnetic stresses. But you'd not understand, and I don't really. And I suppose, inside of me, I don't believe it's anything of the kind for a minute. I'm not built that way. And yet, I don't know. Perhaps there may have been some rotten thing done aboard of her. Or again, it's a heap more likely to be something quite outside of anything I know." "If they're immaterial, then, they're spirits?" he questioned. "I don't know," I said. "It's so hard to say what I really think, I've got a queer idea that my headpiece likes to think good, but I don't believe my tummy believes it." "Go on," he said. "Well," I said, "suppose the Earth were inhabited by two kinds of life. We're one, and they're the other." "Go on," he said. "Well," I said, "don't you see, in a normal state, we may not be capable of appreciating the realness of the other, but they may be just as real and material to them as we are to us. Do you see?" "Yes," he said. "Go on." "Well," I said, "the Earth may be just as real to them as to us. I mean that it may have qualities as material to them as it has to us, but neither of us could appreciate the other's realness, or the quality of realness in the Earth, which was real to the other. It's so difficult to explain. Don't you understand?" "Yes," he said. "Go on." "Well, if we were in what I might call a healthy atmosphere, they would be quite beyond our power to see or feel or anything. And the same with them. But the more we're like this, the more real and actual they could grow to us. See? That is, the more we should become able to appreciate their form of materialness. That's all. I can't make it any clearer." "Then, after all, you really think they're ghosts, or something of that sort?" Tammy said. "I suppose it does come to that," I answered. "I mean that, anyway, I don't think they're our ideas of flesh and blood. But, of course, it's silly to say much. And after all, you must remember that I may be all wrong." "I think you ought to tell the second mate all this," he said. "If it's really as you say, the ship ought to be put into the nearest port and jolly well burnt." "The second mate couldn't do anything," I replied, "even if he believed it all, which we're not certain he would." "Perhaps not," Tammy answered. "But if you could get him to believe it, he might explain the whole business to the skipper, and then something might be done. It's not safe as it is." "He'd only get jeered at again," I said, rather hopelessly. "No," said Tammy, "not after what's happened tonight." "Perhaps not," I replied doubtfully. And just then the second mate came back onto the poop, and Tammy cleared away from the wheelbox, leaving me with a worrying feeling that I ought to do something. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Coming of the Mist and That Which It Ushered. We buried Williams at midday. Poor beggar. It had been so sudden. All day the men were awed and gloomy, and there was a lot of talk about there being a Jonah aboard. If they'd only known what Tommy and I, and perhaps the second mate, knew. And then the next thing came, the mist. I cannot remember now whether it was on the day we buried Williams that we first saw it, or the day after. When first I noticed it, like everybody else aboard, I took it to be some sort of haze, due to the heat of the sun, for it was broad daylight when the thing came. The wind had died away to a light breeze, and I was working at the main rigging, along with Plummer, putting on seizings. "Looks as if 'twere middlin' 'ot," he remarked. "Yes," I said, and for the time took no further notice. Presently he spoke again. "It's getting quite hazy," and his tone showed he was surprised. I glanced up quickly. At first I could see nothing. Then I saw what he meant. The air had a wavy, strange, unnatural appearance. Something like the heated air over the top of an engine's funnel that you can often see when no smoke is coming out. "Must be the heat," I said, "though I don't remember ever seeing anything just like it before." "Nor me," Plummer agreed. It could not have been a minute later when I looked up again and was astonished to find that the whole ship was surrounded by a thinnish haze that quite hid the horizon. "By Jove, Plummer," I said, "how queer." "Yes," he said, looking around. "I'd never seen anything like it before, not in these parts." "Heat wouldn't do that," I said. "No," he said doubtfully. We went on with our work again, occasionally exchanging an odd word or two. Presently, after a little time of silence, I bent forward and asked him to pass me up the spike. He stooped and picked it up from the deck, where it had tumbled. As he held it out to me, I saw the stolid expression on his face change suddenly to a look of complete surprise. He opened his mouth. "By gum," he said, "it's gone." I turned quickly and looked. And so it had, the whole sea showing clear and bright, right away to the horizon. I stared at Plummer, and he stared at me. "Well, I'm blowed," he exclaimed. I do not think I made any reply, for I had a sudden, queer feeling that the thing was not right. And then, in a minute, I called myself an ass. But I could not really shake off the feeling. I had another good look at the sea. I had a vague idea that something was different. The sea looked brighter somehow, and the air clearer, I thought, and I missed something. But not much, you know. And it was not until a couple of days later that I knew that it was several vessels on the horizon, which had been quite in sight before the mist, and now were gone. During the rest of the watch, and indeed all day, there was no further sign of anything unusual. Only, when the evening came, in the second dog watch it was, I saw the mist rise faintly, the setting sun shining through it, dim and unreal. I knew then, as a certainty, that it was not caused by heat. And that was the beginning of it. The next day I kept a pretty close watch, during all my time on deck. But the atmosphere remained clear. Yet I heard from one of the chaps in the mate's watch that it had been hazy during part of the time he was at the wheel. "Comin' and goin' like," he described it to me when I questioned him about it. He thought it might be heat. But though I knew otherwise, I did not contradict him. At that time, no one, not even Plummer, seemed to think very much of the matter, and when I mentioned it to Tammy and asked him whether he'd noticed it, he only remarked that it must have been heat or else the sun drawing up water. I let it stay at that, for there was nothing to be gained by suggesting that the thing had more to it. Then on the following day, something happened that set me wondering more than ever, and showed me how right I had been in feeling the mist to be something unnatural. It was in this way. 5 bells, and the 8 to 12 morning watch had gone. I was at the wheel. The sky was perfectly clear, not a cloud to be seen, even on the horizon. It was hot, standing at the wheel, for there was scarcely any wind, and I was feeling drowsy. The second mate was down on the main deck with the men, seeing about some job he wanted done, so that I was on the poop alone. Presently, with the heat, and the sun beating right down onto me, I grew thirsty, and for want of something better, I pulled out a bit of plug I had on me and bit off a chew, though as a rule it is not a habit of mine. After a little, naturally enough, I glanced round for the spittoon, but discovered that it was not there. Probably it had been taken forward when the decks were washed to give it a scrub. So, as there was no one on the poop, I left the wheel and stepped aft to the taffrail. It was thus that I came to see something altogether unthought of. A full-rigged ship, close-hauled on the port tack, a few hundred yards on our starboard quarter. Her sails were scarcely filled by the light breeze, and flapped as she lifted to the swell of the sea. She appeared to have very little way through the water, certainly not more than a knot an hour. Away aft, hanging from the gaff end, was a string of flags. Evidently, she was signaling to us. All this I saw in a flash, and I just stood and stared, astonished. I was astonished because I had not seen her earlier. In that light breeze, I knew that she must have been in sight for at least a couple of hours. Yet I could think of nothing rational to satisfy my wonder. There she was, of that much I was certain. And yet, how had she come there without my seeing her before? All at once, as I stood staring, I heard the wheel behind me spin rapidly. Instinctively, I jumped to get hold of the spokes, for I did not want the steering gear jammed. Then I turned again to have another look at the other ship, but to my utter bewilderment, there was no sign of her, nothing but the calm ocean, spreading away to the distant horizon. I blinked my eyelids a bit and pushed the hair off my forehead. Then I stared again, but there was no vestige of her. Nothing, you know, and absolutely nothing unusual, except a faint, tremulous quiver in the air, and the blank surface of the sea reaching everywhere to the empty horizon. Had she foundered, I asked myself, naturally enough, and for the moment I really wondered. I searched round the sea for wreckage, but there was nothing, not even an odd hen-coop or a piece of deck furniture, and so I threw away that idea as impossible. Then, as I stood, I got another thought, or perhaps an intuition, and I asked myself seriously whether this disappearing ship might not be in some way connected with the other queer things. It occurred to me then that the vessel I had seen was nothing real, and perhaps did not exist outside of my own brain. I considered the idea gravely. It helped to explain the thing, and I could think of nothing else that would. Had she been real, I felt sure that others aboard us would have been bound to have seen her long before I had. I got a bit muddled there, with trying to think it out, and then, abruptly, the reality of the other ship came back to me. Every rope and sail and spar, you know. And I remembered how she had lifted to the heave of the sea, and how the sails had flapped in the light breeze. And the string of flags. She had been signaling. At that last, I found it just as impossible to believe that she had not been real. I had reached to this point of irresolution, and was standing with my back partly turned to the wheel. I was holding it steady with my left hand, while I looked over the sea to try to find something to help me to understand. All at once, as I stared, I seemed to see the ship again. She was more on the beam now than on the quarter, but I thought little of that in the astonishment of seeing her once more. It was only a glimpse I caught of her, dim and wavering, as though I looked at her through the convolutions of heated air. Then she grew indistinct and vanished again. But I was convinced now that she was real, and had been in sight all the time if I could have seen her. That curious, dim, wavering appearance had suggested something to me. I remembered the strange, wavy look of the air a few days previously, just before the mist had surrounded the ship. And in my mind I connected the two. It was nothing about the other packet that was strange. The strangeness was with us. It was something that was about or invested our ship that prevented me, or indeed anyone else aboard, from seeing that other. It was evident that she had been able to see us, as was proved by her signaling. In an irrelevant sort of way, I wondered what the people aboard of her thought of our apparently intentional disregard of their signals. After that, I thought of the strangeness of it all. Even at that minute, they could see us plainly, and yet, so far as we were concerned, the whole ocean seemed empty. It appeared to me at that time to be the weirdest thing that could happen to us. And then a fresh thought came to me. How long had we been like that? I puzzled for a few moments. It was now that I recollected that we had sighted several vessels on the morning of the day when the mist appeared, and since then we had seen nothing. This, to say the least, should have struck me as queer, for some of the other packets were homeward bound along with us, and steering the same course. Consequently, with the weather being fine and the wind next to nothing, they should have been in sight all the time. This reasoning seemed to me to show, unmistakably, some connection between the coming of the mist and our inability to see. So that it is possible we had been in that extraordinary state of blindness for nearly 3 days. In my mind, the last glimpse of that ship on the quarter came back to me, and, I remember, a curious thought got me, that I had looked at her from out of some other dimension. For a while, I really believed the mystery of the idea, and that it might be the actual truth took me, instead of my realizing just all that it might mean. It seemed so exactly to express all the half-defined thoughts that had come since seeing that other packet on the quarter. Suddenly, behind me, there came a rustle and a rattle of the sails, and in the same instant I heard the skipper saying, "Where the devil have you got her to, Jessup?" I whirled round to the wheel. "I don't know, sir," I faltered. I had forgotten even that I was at the wheel. "Don't know?" he shouted. "I should damned well think you don't. Starboard your helm, you fool! You'll have us all aback." "Aye, aye, sir," I answered, and hove the wheel over. I did it almost mechanically, for I was still dazed and had not yet had time to collect my senses. During the following half-minute, I was only conscious, in a confused sort of way, that the old man was ranting at me. This feeling of bewilderment passed off, and I found that I was peering blankly into the binnacle, at the compass card, yet, until then, entirely without being aware of the fact. Now, however, I saw that the ship was coming back onto her course. Goodness knows how much she had been off. With the realization that I had let the ship get almost aback, there came a sudden memory of the alteration in the position of the other vessel. She had appeared last on the beam instead of on the quarter. Now, however, as my brain began to work, I saw the cause of this apparent, and until then, inexplicable change. It was due, of course, to our having come up, until we had brought the other packet onto the beam. It is curious how all this flashed through my mind, and held my attention, although only momentarily, in the face of the skipper's storming. I think I had hardly realized he was still singing out at me. Anyhow, the next thing I remember, he was shaking my arm. "What's the matter with you, man?" he was shouting, and I just stared into his face, like an ass, without saying a word. I seemed still incapable, of actual reasoning speech. "Are you damned well off your head?" he went on shouting. "Are you a lunatic? Have you had sunstroke? Speak, you gaping idiot!" I tried to say something, but the words would not come clearly. I said, and stopped stupidly. I was all right, really, but I was so bewildered with the thing I had found out, and in a way I seemed almost to have come back out of a distance, "You're a lunatic," he said again. He repeated the statement several times, as if it were the only thing that sufficiently expressed his opinion of me. Then he let go of my arm and stepped back a couple of paces. "I'm not a lunatic," I said with a sudden gasp. "I'm not a lunatic, sir, any more than you are." "Why the devil don't you answer my questions, then?" he shouted angrily. "What's the matter with you? What have you been doing with the ship? Answer me now." "I was looking at that ship away on the starboard quarter, sir," I blurted out. "She's been signaling." "What?" He cut me short with disbelief. "What ship?" He turned quickly and looked over the quarter. Then he wheeled round to me again. "There's no ship. What do you mean by trying to spin up a cover like that?" "There is, sir," I answered. "It's out there." I pointed. "Hold your tongue," he said. "Don't talk rubbish to me. Do you think I'm blind?" "I saw it, sir," I persisted. "Don't you talk back to me," he snapped with a quick burst of temper. "I won't have it." Then, just as suddenly, he was silent. He came a step towards me and stared into my face. I believe the old ass thought I was a bit mad. Anyway, without another word, he went to the break of the poop. "Mr. Tullipson," he sung out. "Yes, sir," I heard the second mate reply. "Send another man to the wheel." "Very good, sir," the second answered. A couple of minutes later, old Jasket came up to relieve me. I gave him the course, and he repeated it. "What's up, mate?" he asked me as I stepped off the grating. "Nothing much," I said, and went forward to where the skipper was standing on the break of the poop. I gave him the course, but the crabby old devil took no notice of me whatever. When I got down onto the main deck, I went up to the second and gave it to him. He answered me civilly enough, and then asked me what I had been doing to put the old man's back up. I told him there's a ship on the starboard quarter signaling us, I said. "There's no ship out there, Jessup," the second mate replied, looking at me with a queer, inscrutable expression. "There is, sir," I began. "That will do, Jessup," he said. "Go forward and have a smoke. I shall want you then to give a hand with these foot ropes. You better bring a serving mallet aft with you when you come." I hesitated a moment, partly in anger, but more, I think, in doubt. "Aye, aye, sir," I muttered at length, and went forward. End of Chapter 7.